And this is the first episode of Detonation for 2020, and I tell you what, it's been a crazy start of the year here in Australia. We've had all the climate change stuff coming true, as we've talked about on this show. We've had fires that have wiped out the size of like Wales, like 11 million hectares. We've had hurricanes. We've had, in America, you've got a hurricane, what we call hurricanes or cyclones. We've had all sorts of crazy stuff going on down here, but there are technological solutions, which we have been talking about here on this show. But to bring in the 2020s, this whole new decade, we're going to talk about religion. Religion is something really interesting. It's something that's been lingering around the human psyche. It offers solutions to problems of life and death, and what is the meaning of life, and existential answers, and the continuity of civilizations and cultures. And this is it's a really interesting institution. And we have a panel here who thinks that religion is either on its way out, or it doesn't really fit in the modern mode of society, this secular society that we've built up around us. There's many, many pressures on religion at this point of time, whether they be technology or advancements in physics or metaphysics, or artificial intelligence, or virtual reality. Virtual reality is raising lots and lots of implications for who is God, what is God. Anyway, we have a whole host of interesting guests, and of course Ben Zion 2020 has come back to talk to us as well. Thank you, Ben Zion, for coming back. But we'll start up there with John. John, just introduce yourself. We'll just hit around the room. Who are you? Why are you interested in this topic of religion, atheism, secularism, all these interesting things?
Okay, that's a pretty broad introduction. My name is John Miele. I'm known on Facebook as Johnny D. And for me, it was a personal thing, because I've seen, because I was involved in evangelical religion when I was younger, I saw the damage that was being done. And I saw the disconnect that it was having for people who were deeply involved. I see where when they try to get out, it's hard for them to get out. But at the same time, there are social pressures now, which are, as you were mentioning, because of all these trends in society that are converging. I see people having to do one of two things. Either they go to the far extreme and they marginalize themselves, or they have to come to the center and sort of abandon what their core beliefs really are as they live their lives. Almost like Nietzsche was saying, God is dead and we killed him. It's not the atheist, it's not the irreligious who are doing this. It's the people who profess religion, because it's sterile. And I think that ultimately is going to be its death.
Hello, Ren, and welcome to Detonation. Thank you very much for coming along. Just introduce yourself and what you would like to say in your introduction to this panel here on religion.
Okay, my name is David Rand. I'm president of an atheist organization here in Montreal, in Quebec, in Canada. And the theme of our discussion is ending hereditary religion, that is, ending the indoctrination of children. And I think that it's a very important topic, because it is the main process whereby religion is perpetrated and continues to propagate itself. If children were not indoctrinated into the religion of their parents, it would largely die out rather quickly. And so religion in schools, influence on children is a very important topic. I think that religious morality, for example, is something that's largely vacuous, and I agree with what John said about what the religious are promoting currently is sterile. If you look closely at it, it's like they have nothing to offer. And morality has to be based on our needs as human beings, and independent of any religious belief. It's based on things like human rights. It's based on the fact that we're a social species. Our human beings have built up moral codes through our biological and cultural evolution, and even many different cultures. We still have many things in common. We can agree on many things, like gratuitous violence is not such a good thing, and sharing is often a good thing, and there are commonalities that bind us together in spite of religion. And so I think our survival as a species depends on us distancing ourselves more and more from our religious background.
Thank you very much, and I want to talk more about this hereditary aspect. I myself was raised in a hereditary organization, that being Jehovah's Witnesses, and I have a lot to say on that exact topic. Thank you very much, Rand. Mr. Orenstein, how are you? Who are you, and what do you bring to the panel? Lovely to have you here.
Well, first of all, I ask myself that question all the time, who I am, and depending on the day, I get a very different answer. But I'm a
and I must mention that you've got a shirt. It says 98% chimp.
That's correct. I don't know if you can see it or not, but I'm a professor of anthropology at the University of New York. I'm a humanist chaplain. I serve the American Humanist Association, United Nations, as well as on the Center for Free Thought Equality. I'm on their board, as well as the Smithsonian Institution. And my concerns about religion equal that of my fine panelist friends here. I always go back, and I was saying this earlier, to what St. Ignatius said, which was, to paraphrase, give me the child for 7 years or so, and then I'll give you the man, and first of all, it's an interesting quote because he didn't say woman. So there's a lot of innuendo in the whole idea of who really should have power. And it's certainly not more than 50% of the world's population, according to most religions, especially organized religions. I'm concerned about religiosity and phony spiritualism and all of these issues, because I think, like a lot of us on our panel, maybe, we have skin in the game. We share a planet that requires a lot of support. And I think for the last few thousand years, the idea of religion being the way to get there has been shown itself finally since Darwin. I think Darwin really did help kill religion, as Huxley said. But certainly in the last 150 years, we know so much more as our science has progressed that we can be good without God, and then in fact we can be better without God.
Thank you very much. Ben Zion 2020, you're a presidential candidate running for President of the United States. Zoltan Itzvan, who you know very well, he's a renowned atheist, and he's running on the Republican ticket, which is basically an evangelical party. How do you fit into this panel, and what do you bring to the table?
Well, I'm fairly ambivalent on some of these matters, to be perfectly frank. I haven't taken in recent years the same hardline position that Mr. Isfan takes, and it's not because I find those values to be wholly at odds with what I want, but maybe more because in the interest of not seeming so terribly strident. And folks have probably noticed that Mr. Isfan, in pivoting to the Republican Party, has also pivoted on this matter as well. He's not writing quite so many essays talking about how religiosity is a poison that confuses the mind and degrades society. So I would, but yes, I have not been a person of faith as such in my life, but I did attend for many years a Unitarian Universalist service, and you and I, of course, put together a panel with religious transhumanists, and I was proud to sit with those folks. and discuss ideas like universalism and the role of some kind of a belief or religious moderation in techno progress. I think that these are ideas that are of interest to people, and I think that we have to weigh all of these things. I would say that we were talking in the pre-interview. The United States, religiosity in the United States, the people who identify as being religious, has dropped off by about 25% in as many years. And I wonder what the other panelists think. If, for example, the role of something as simple as Google, the ability to have information and at the tip of your fingers at an early age, if the other panelists might think that has a role in a more skeptical generation.
Well, Ben, keep that one in your back pocket. We'll come back.
Religiosity in this country.
Keep that one in your back pocket. We'll come back to the role of technology and information in a sec. But I want to jump over to Rand. Rand, you're involved with ending hereditary religion. Can you lay out the framework of why this is an important mission? Why is this this issue important? What's the framework and the groundwork? Aren't you disrupting natural flows and mechanisms of society if you do this? What's the negatives? What's the positives?
Well, I think that the most essential thing is that children should not be identified with the religion of their parents. That is, children should be considered to be religion should be considered to be a thing for adults, like sex and alcohol. In other words, children should be considered to be not ready for that, not mature enough. And so, for example, there's no such thing as a Christian child or a Muslim child or even an atheist child. There's simply children who happen to have Christian parents or Muslim parents or atheist parents, and the way this has to be put into practice is in public schools, which already do a relatively good job, but could do a better one in allowing children to transcend, so to speak, the particular worldview of their parents, without necessarily contradicting it, but simply going to an educationalist, going to school where they are not considered part of a religion or part of an ideology. They receive an education which is as universalist as possible.
So you would like to treat all children as free agents, and you don't want sort of any institutional manipulation, whether that be from the family or from the state or from community services, on their beliefs up to a certain period of time, so for example, an age. Is that correct?
Well, I think that all children, I mean, they're not free agents, they're not mature enough, but they should be all treated the same regardless of their religious background. Exceptions should not be made. And then as they mature and they move on towards adulthood, then they're mature enough to make their own decision about what to do, whether they adopt the religion of their parents or a different religion or no religion or become atheists or not, whatever. But they should be considered to be sort of I think off limits for propaganda, so to speak.
Is it because?
So, for example, yeah, go ahead.
Is it because you see children when they're given the beliefs of their parents? Is it because they're damaged in your mind, or is it because you're limiting their freedom, or is it because it's damaging to society as a whole, or what's the actual problem with being given a religion? Especially, let's say it's a religion that's been passed down for hundreds of years through your family. Isn't that just a family decision?
Well, I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with passing on religious traditions in the home, but the child must be allowed to be free from that for at least part of the day when they're at school. so that they can have a fresh look and have a more objective view. If they're always sort of submerged in the culture, the religious culture of their parents, then they don't have the freedom to develop their own point of view. And children are at a young age, they're too young to know the difference, for example, between a belief and a fact. If you tell a very young child that Jesus was born of a virgin according to the Catholic Church or whatever, then they're probably going to take that as some kind of a fact, as if you told them that the speed of light is constant in a vacuum. The subtleties that, oh, this is a belief. It's not a fact. It's not been proven. That's maybe a little too subtle for very young children, and so it's important that they receive a non-religious education throughout their childhood, which does not exclude having, learning about their parents' religion. It doesn't exclude that, but they must be able to have a space in their lives where they can go beyond that.
It's kind of funny because being raised Jehovah's Witness, we never had Christmas, and therefore we never had Santa Claus. But I always thought kids were faking it when they were found out that Santa Claus wasn't real. But it wasn't until a while later that I actually realized that kids thought Santa was real, for real, and they actually got really disappointed. So this is a really good point about fact versus belief. John, what do you say? How do you react to this? What do you say? Do you agree? Do you disagree with this idea? I think Rand's mainly talking about states, so primary school staying out of teaching religion. But what do you say to this family hereditary religion idea?
Was that directed at me? I wasn't
yes,
sure.
Yes, John, yes.
Okay. I have a different take because I see religion as a cultural artifact. I don't think you can divorce it from the family's traditions, and I don't think it needs to be. I have a couple of reasons for that. Just thinking of my own upbringing as a child, I was raised as a Roman Catholic. I didn't stay a Roman Catholic, but I had an odyssey that I won't go through now. But I remember the things that were the most influential to me were the family gatherings that we did around certain holidays. But what didn't take was the supernatural stuff, because my family was not really religious. So we went through the motions. And we had Santa Claus and we had the Christmas tree, and these were all very good feelings. And I think as I got older, a kid makes a transition. The Santa Claus thing is the first step. The Santa Claus thing where they say, oh, there's no Santa Claus. Okay. So now they take things with a grain of salt. And I think that most children will take it with a grain of salt and push it to the side and secularize. Now, I will say that there are religious groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses, as was your experience, sometimes with the Mormons, sometimes with ultra-religious either Muslim or Jewish sects, or with a lot of not exclusively all, but a lot of evangelical religions will create that insular effect, right? And that's dangerous because they don't get a chance to breathe. But any exposure to secular thinking, if there's a gateway, I think kids see bullshit when it's bullshit. Excuse my French, but they do. They do. And I think the best thing we can do is let people see that mom and dad have a cultural tie. Maybe I will too, but it's not as damaging unless they get into that insular. I think we should make the distinction between insular religions and the religion of the masses, pretty much. I agree 100% with David with the insular religions and with your experience, but I don't know if you have to worry too much about the Catholics, the Lutherans, most religious sects, because people don't take their religion seriously, and I think that's the best thing going for us.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Mr. Orenstein, you had something to add, and you've got a little sidekick there. Good to see.
Yes, as I was saying, like I said, I have a skin in the game, and that was my 5-year-old who is deeply infatuated with Santa Claus. And while we have dissuaded her from that belief, because I see children have such incredible imaginations that it's very easy to accept Santa as being real because Santa brings you stuff and Santa loves me. And it's very easy to replace Santa with name your God. Depending on the religion. Like I grew up in the Jewish tradition, but I don't think there was a minute in my life where I took it seriously personally. And I'm a pretty old guy. This is my second time around, as I like to say. The universe has a great sense of humor because I have a 25-year-old and a 23-year-old and now a 5-year-old and can tell you that all three of them, well, certainly my older two, are definitely atheists. And it did take them long to understand, without too much prodding from me, to become non. Just once you reach the age of reason, if you get some ideas, the ideas of science, the ideas of humanism, the ideas of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, for anything that you might try to learn in a catechism or anything that you might learn from a different tradition, while I'm not in any way saying that those harm the masses, in some cases they can if the religion is very radical, as my colleagues have said. And, it doesn't take long to see if you're evangelical that you are going to try to create a culture in a nation that is devoid of any secularism. The reality is that if you're standing tall and you're standing strong and you're standing for the ideals that you have been developed over your own life, on an individual level, one child can change the world, and multiple children. And we see this in the United States with, all these secular organizations. We see this with Camp Quest, giving children alternatives other than religious alternatives in order to grow and become good people, to be good in essentially good human beings. And that to me is the most valuable thing that anything we can do as activists, wherever we are on the spectrum of our activism, is to remind the next generation, and actually really go both ways, but certainly to remind the next generation coming up that that there are alternatives, and very healthy and good alternatives that have nothing to do with religion, that can make you as humane or more humane than your parents in some cases.
Thank you very much. Ben Zion, you've heard the other panelists on family hereditary religion. What do you have to say and have to add to this conversation?
Yes. Well, I'd like to congratulate Dr. Orenstein. I cannot imagine a better way to honor this day of protest of child indoctrination than to have raised so many free-thinking children, or these free-thinking children.
Giving it my best shot. I'm very good friends with Dan Barker, and Dan has a very religious daughter, and I said, well, what is it that when you guys are sitting around the dinner table, what is it that you're focusing on? And he said to me that what they try to do is think above this, and that think about the things that bring us together rather than the things that tear us apart. And I think that that's a very healthy way of showing that not only can we be good without God, but that we can be better without God, because it's much more easy for people who are without faith to be open to people with faith, and I think vice versa. And I
Mr.
think that's what gives somewhat of the moral high ground.
Mr. Orenstein, if you set out the correct conditions, for example, for a child and, a free-thinking child, and they came to religion on their own, let's say not a radical religion, just say, some sort of generic religion, is that a success to you if they adopt a religion and God, brought up in the primordial soup of these ideas of rationality? Is that acceptable, or would you be upset?
I would be deeply upset because, I've spent a lifetime seeing the culture and the mechanisms of religion as being an artifact of our human experience that goes back thousands of years, but we can make lots of very good choices and better choices than to be religious in the world today. So I would, if one of my children would say to me, Dad, I found Jesus or Buddha or Yahweh or whomever, the potato god, I would be personally disappointed because I don't think that those metaphysics are necessarily helpful for seeing the world as it is. But what I still love my child, but I couldn't, I wouldn't necessarily. Then what you're doing is essentially what a lot of the radical religions do, which is, to shun. And I'd much rather leave the door open than close it on a person.
Ben Zion, did you have anything more to add?
Yes. One moment. Okay, sorry about that. Yes, well, I did want to say a little. Dr. Orenstein, you also mentioned an interest in Santa Claus. A young person, your young daughter, being amused by that, and I think that this draws into focus a problem here that is as concerning as it's easy when talking about these matters. Anyone on any side of the issue, we talked about this in the pre-interview briefly as well, to be drawn into some kind of culture wars, and I hope that the discussions, at least on the part of rationalists, can turn on outcomes rather than this. And so, what does this have to do with Santa Claus? Well, for example, if someone had raised their child with a lot of talk about space aliens, some unhealthy preoccupation with the belief in space aliens, nothing to do with conventional upbringing, that child might be more inclined to magical thinking later in life, a lack of critical thinking, other concerns that we would tend to associate with people who proselytize or force their children into a religious literalist worldview. And that is a problem and has a cost for society, a high degree of this kind of magical thinking, and we have to address that. We have to address the ways in which our own country here in the United States and in many other countries are sometimes leaning toward theocracy. I'm inclined to believe, even though I am very sympathetic to religious moderates, particularly those of the techno-progressive kind, that religious literalists, are basically all latent theocrats. If you get a group of them together, they will start to plot and scheme to build a theocracy. That's not a real nice place to live, generally. There's problems with living there. And so we have to have these kinds of discussions and be very honest with these people about the problems that derive from this very real slippery slope.
It's kind of interesting you mentioned that, Ben, because, there's the family. The family was very famous in the United States as a secretive Christian organization that was trying to infiltrate had infiltrated various governments and the U.S. government around the world, even though it's enshrined in the Constitution to have a separation of church and state. Rand, I want to come back to you. I was going to ask you, so religion touches on some of the biggest topics that are kind of unexplainable for humans. It's birth and death, the meaning of life. They give certain cultural instincts to people and morality. The Ten Commandments, for example, that's law. So does ending religion sort of create a vacuum, and how do we fill the vacuum that ending religion creates, or does it create that? Are you creating a cultural vacuum?
I don't think that an absence of religion creates a vacuum. I think that if religion fills any needs, it doesn't fill any needs that couldn't be better served without religion, and everything that religion provides, if anything, could be better provided by human morality independent of religion. For example, religion pretends to provide, we're talking about morality, but also meaning and explanations. And well, as we know, those explanations are basically off the top of their heads, or inherited from some ancient pre-scientific tradition, or they're simply not valid, except maybe by chance occasionally. And so in terms of access to knowledge, religion needs to be replaced by science. I think we can all agree on that, to anchor our knowledge of the real world. Religion posits a supernatural plane for which there's no evidence, and which is by definition inaccessible. So the supernatural is practically meaningless, because if you could see it or measure it in any way, it would be part of the natural world, and it wouldn't be supernatural anymore. So no, I don't think we need to replace religion by something, except, as I say, as a source of knowledge. The various sciences are our source, and morality, we get that from our own social. The fact that we're a social species, and our evolution, biological and cultural evolution. I also like to mention this concept that religions that promote isolation that are very extreme are very dangerous, but then there are lots of others, sort of warm and fuzzy and moderate ones. But I'm not comfortable with that kind of division, because it's a continuum. And certainly the moderate ones aren't nearly as dangerous as the more fundamentalist and strict ones, but they do tend to enable them and to facilitate them and excuse them. The existence of moderate religion gives religion in general a sort of a pass that you've got to respect it, and this facilitates greatly the fundamentalists and the extremists to a large extent. So I think we do need to criticize so-called moderate religion as well as the more extremist.
John, I'll move over to you. What do you think about this idea of a cultural continuality that is with religion, and also on this notion that you brought up about the continuum between, or what was now being explained as a continuum between moderate religions and extremist religions? What do you say, John?
Well, let me just say that in principle, if I could have what David's talking about, I would prefer that. But I can't see a way that we could, I guess, in a civilized way, tear people away. I think the point I'm trying to get at, and let me get away from the words I just used, because I think I just got myself in trouble. But what I was trying to get at is, I think most people have religion as a form of formal identity. It doesn't strike them in the core. For instance, even your, and I don't want to go down the gun debate road, but right now it's God and guns. with a lot of fundamentalist churches.
Mm-hmm.
And if they truly believed that God protects them, if they truly believed, like the scripture says, that it's vain for you to rise up early, to retire late, for he gives to his beloved even in his sleep, and that he opens his hand and satisfies. I am quoting the Ashrei in there, so in case David recognizes that. But the idea is that, most people don't take their religion seriously when it comes to life and death matters. They still go to the doctors when they have an infection. They get their arm set. I'm not even sure if Christian scientists take their religion so seriously when there's a broken bone, And I just think that the effort that people put into it is getting less. It's taken less seriously. You don't consult with your priest when you're going to you plant your crops. You don't consult with your priest when you're looking for a job. And I think that is something that we should give a pass to, only because it kills itself in the end. But I do agree, again, when religion takes privileges, like I used the Catholics as an example before. There's things about the Catholic Church that I find very reprehensible. Obviously, the child abuse that's going on, the fact that they're so wealthy and they get a tax-free pass. In my town, the most beautiful house, never mind building, but house, is owned by the local Catholic Church, and they don't pay property taxes. We pay it through the nose. So in that sense, I do have my issues. And like I said, in a perfect world, I would love to push all that out, but I don't think we can. If we could focus on the dialogue with people who really are sort of feeling, well, I'm having this trauma because my religion is telling me this, but I'm not seeing it. I think that's probably the best place for us to expend our energy. So it's not so much a matter of disagreement. I wanted to say that as much as emphasis and economy, I think we can do more good with people who are having to deal with the realities of life and seeing that, the magic beads don't work.
Yes, very, very good. Two excellent topics there I'll move on to soon. Taxes and what replaces religion and the spiritual void. I like that. Mr. Orenstein, what do you say? Do you think that religion offers a sort of continuality culturally, or in any way that's beneficial, or do you think that replacing it be bad to society? What do you say?
Well, I think that people have for thousands of years depended on their faith and their faith traditions in order to give them personal identity and community identity. It's very clear. There's historical evidence for this. However, I'm a numbers guy as well, being an academic, and you could look at the data, which shows that regardless of what I think, the trends are that religion is less and less a percentage, at least in Europe, certainly certain parts of Europe, but in a powerful force for goodness and truth. If you look at, which is a religious version of, and their data indicates, and I get their email blasts all the time saying, we've done more surveys, more and more people are leaving their faith. Younger people do not see faith the way older generations have. The Vatican has statistic services which show the same data, that the footprint of organized is getting smaller. The question is, does it ever disappear? And I don't know. I mean, in New York, the largest real estate owner is not Donald Trump, but it's the church. They have a lot of real estate holdings. I think As an anthropologist, I always think in terms of how do things speciate, how do they adapt, and eventually how do they become extinct. And we see this with language, we see this with culture, and so on and so forth. And I think that's the thing that that in some places around the world, religious belief has become near extinct. And I think it's going in the right direction, because what it replaces it is, at least one hopes, is the idea that we can be good without God. And again, it's central to.
You're an anthropologist, so what do you see? Because I always find it interesting when I look at the spread of religion. It's a human idea. I mean, it's not like animals are talking to each other, spreading religions around animal communities. It's a human idea, and it needs to be transmitted via some sort of information complex. So in ancient Egypt, it had to be written up on a wall by hieroglyphics, and the people with the most information, the high priest.
Well, most of it is authority.
Yeah.
It comes down to authority and fear of death. Those are the things.
So how do you see events like Constantine? You know how he brought down the Roman pagan gods and replaced it with a Christian god. How do you see events like that?
Well, again, if we look at it through the idea of adaptation, speciation, and extinction, what you're looking at is religion as just adapting to another idea. We went at the earliest time in our species when we were spiritual, before we lived in city-states, we were all animists. There were gods everywhere. Of course, pagan gods or polytheistic world, and we went to monotheistic world, and here we are on this continuum of being a large percentage of the Earth's population now, 1.2 billion people, not having any religion at all. And I think that's going in the right direction. I think it will take us some time to get there, but I think we have time on our side. I think that science answers the fundamental questions that religion used to do. I think our ethics, especially our humanist ethics, one of the panelists said, well, I think science will replace religion. And I don't know if it's necessarily science that will, but certainly humanist morality will replace religion, because if you're looking for an ethical standpoint of where to moor your ideas, primarily in science, although science is the search for truth, but it's in ethics, which really focuses on how to be good and how to treat other people. And it's very clear that that's within our DNA, and that we don't need a book, whatever you subscribe to, the book that you might subscribe to, some holy book, for us to be good. We are very good without God.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and the way that rulers of ancient societies always looked at religion is really interesting as well. I'm a Napoleon Bonaparte nerd and fan, and he said religion is excellent stuff for keeping common people quiet. Religion is what keeps poor people from murdering the rich. And this guy had no respect for religion to the point where he got the Pope to come out of Rome to anoint him in Paris. So he didn't really care. And it's kind of interesting. And I remember in the founding of Russia, the rulers of Russia were considering what religion. I can't remember, Ivan the Terrible, somebody, and he was going to choose Islam because Islam was nice and strict, and he thought it could keep the religious people in line. But he couldn't consume alcohol, so he said, "Oh well, that's off the books. Everyone will have to be a Christian then." So the rulers' attitudes towards religion is exactly that. It's all about authority and power and things like that. Ben Zion, what do you say?
Yes. Well, it's interesting. We discussed this. It was alluded to in this talk, and also we discussed it in the pre-interview. You mentioned this sort of cynical manipulation on the part of Napoleon, and that's very same sort of cynicism and manipulation is at the heart of this a resurgence of the so-called Christian right, or moral majority, the religious right rather. We talked about how these evangelicals were rather different folks before the 1980s. Many of them were a little bit more reluctant to engage in this kind of rabid political religious hybrid. But it is very much the manipulation of the very same kind of mechanisms that will allow a Fox News to pollute the minds of so many people, that would allow this right-wing noise machine, hate radio, and so forth, to pollute the minds of so many people. This didn't happen by accident. It was a feature of that very same cynicism of confusing a certain class of people in the interest of imposing a more corporatist state across the United States. And that's very, very upsetting. And people recognize that is, I think, also a part of the reason that we've seen this drop off in religiosity, because it's become associated with this debased form of itself.
And it's interesting with this quote unquote drop off is what the panel has been talking about is this lack of respect or lack of seriousness as well. So maybe people will still tick the box, but as John was saying, they don't go to the priest, or they don't, they have affairs and divorces is off the charts, but they still might tick the box it's a bet, right? You're placing your bets. Ben, I just wanted to open with you, then I want to go to John, because John was talking about taxing religion. Can you open up on taxing religion? You're a USTP endorsed candidate. That's involved with public policy. Do you like taxing religion? Do you agree with it? Do you not like it? What's your idea on taxing religion? Then we'll jump over to John.
Well, some folks.
Could I just say before you get started, I just have to step away for half a minute. I'll be right back.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you.
Some folks, even I think very broad-minded folks, say that taxing these religious institutions will force us to then give them a greater weight in certain kinds of political institutions. It will, but they already have a lot of that kind of influence. So to me, it's just down to the raw numbers. A huge amount of revenue would be added to the public trust by taxing these many churches in the United States. So
there's the United States, Ben, and there's also the global government kind of mechanism like the United Nations or something like the World Health Organization or the Labor Union. What about a sort of global tax? They always try to bring in a global tax on, say, something like cigarettes on a World Health. What about this is a mental health issue? What about a world tax, even a very small one that goes towards common humanitarian efforts?
It was nice chatting with you, Dr.
Oh, okay.
Orenstein.
Lovely to meet you.
Thank you for joining us.
I
yes,
apologize for having to cut out.
The thing about international law.
Thank you very much, sir.
Doesn't really exist. But surely standards of this kind, I think I would, and even transnational entities of this kind, I would certainly tend to support. But these transnational entities do exist in a limited way. It's why I'm always pretty amused by people on the far right who, in talking about the goals of techno-futurists, for example, will start to talk about the United Nations taking over the world or something. United Nations is pretty toothless. The idea that the United Nations is trying to take over the world is a little bit ridiculous. I did want to comment on what you said about whether religion leaves a vacuum. I think it was implied that a sort of lack of morals would derive in that vacuum. And I'm inclined, I think, to agree with the other panelists, and that's a resounding no. But I think there is another kind of vacuum, a way of thinking about this. Human beings, cross-culturally, seem to have a very real inclination to some kind of tribalism or identity politics. It's not something that any society seems to be at any removed from. And so, I mean, some have very relatively little of it. You know, Iceland and Sweden really don't have hyper-nationalist cultural properties to any high degree, and they don't practice religiosity to any high degree. So there's certainly a lot of variation there. But I guess in talking about this vacuum, it's important to talk about what is ideal. That people are probably. I think everyone on this panel has probably seen this study. I'll reference this article in The Guardian that describes religious children as being less altruistic, more aggressive, and even violent than secular children. And that flies in the face of this idea that religious people often express, that religion gives them and to others some connection to morality. And I think that is false. If you need the fear of God or something to prevent you from committing heinous acts, that's a reflection on a personal failing of yours, not a larger societal concern. But yes, I think that it is also important to consider. We talked a little bit about the sort of geopolitical implications of religion. It's important to consider in thinking about that vacuum that many of these people in theocratic countries like the United States or other more formally theocratic countries, they will fight for this, and so we have to consider the implications of that as well.
Thanks for those comments. John, you mentioned taxes on religion. What do you think about taxes? Ben said he opened when you left away. He opened and said it might give them a little bit more power in government when they start to get taxed. But what do you say?
Well, I don't feel too powerful, and I'm taxed up the wazoo. But but I think ultimately what's going on is we allow religion to enrich itself through its tax exempt status. And I'm not thinking so much of the little corner church where the preacher gets the subsidy for living and it's acknowledged as a tax break. But I'm more concerned where you get groups like Trinity Broadcasting, where they don't pay Social Security taxes for their employees. I don't know what kind of compensation these folks get as far as retirement, so I can't speak to that. But you have these mega churches raking in millions of dollars and not paying a dime. You have, and I think it was David who mentioned in New York City, prime real estate is owned by the Roman Catholic Church. And when you think of what happens when they don't pay their fair share, if the church is on fire, God doesn't put the fire out. We have to send our fire department out to take care of it. If there's a physical assault in the church, the police have to take care of that. Now, I noticed, and I'm going to give what I noticed one thing in the right direction. In my local area, because of anti-Semitic violence, synagogues have taken on the responsibility to hire their own outside security forces. It's on their dime, and they're actually charging members for that privilege. I think that's a little more realistic, to see that, if you're benefiting from a social thing and you have the ability to contribute, you should be contributing. That's my stand. If you feel that you have a service that you're providing, provide the service. But if that service isn't 100% of your reason for being, you shouldn't be getting a free ride for that. And that's pretty much where I'm coming from.
Rand, what do you say about taxing religion? What's your thoughts?
Well, I believe that I consider there should be no tax exemptions whatsoever for for religious institutions. They should pay the same taxes as everybody else. Exemptions. There are exemptions for charitable organizations, for example, and churches might be able to qualify for exemptions on that basis when they're doing charity.
Right.
But in doing that, they would have to provide their charity in a totally non-sectarian way, and they couldn't proselytize their religion while providing that charity or discriminate against people to whom they're providing it. So they would just they would be receiving an exemption as a true charitable organization and not as a religion. So churches should be taxed just like every other building, and I'm not worried about that, meaning they will get more influence. I'm thinking that will give them a whole lot less influence because they won't have the money to purchase the influence. It will greatly weaken the power of religion by making them pay what everybody else pays, and they will have to survive as we all do on our own resources while still paying taxes, and that will greatly reduce their power. I'd like to say one more thing on the issue of religious morality and non-religious morality. Popular slogan among humanists is to say we can be good without God. We've heard that a few times this evening. But I think that's we need to turn that on its head. That's backwards. We need to say, yes, even religious believers can be good with their God, but it's more difficult. It's easier to be a good person without God. And it's not that we're being good without God. It's that religious people can become better by putting some distance between themselves and their supernatural beliefs. You've probably heard the famous quotation from a Dostoevsky character who said, "If God does not exist, then everything is permitted." But it's actually the other way around. If God does exist, then everything is permitted, because all you have to do is say, "Oh, I'm responding to God's will. I'm behaving according to God's will," and it gives you like a free pass, because nobody can contradict you. Nobody can say, "Well, no, God doesn't want that," because nobody knows what God wants because God doesn't exist. So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
That's really good, and yeah, you're right. I think that a tax would. So what do you say, Rand? Like the Scientologists, they infiltrated the U.S. government. They stole a whole bunch of secrets from the U.S. government, and this, every time the U.S. government tries to do anything with those guys, they say they're going to reveal all the secrets. The Roman Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire. I mean, these guys are politics and power. Is this a problem to getting churches taxed? What's the roadblocks to getting a church tax? I mean, do the churches, as in their current form, just have too much power over governments and governmental systems, or do you think this is even being eroded in the modern day?
Well, we were discussing 2 issues, taxes and morality, and I think that they are in fact related. That is one of the reasons that religions get such a free pass, is they have commandeered the issue of morality. People have swallowed this myth that religions help to preserve morality or to promote morality or promote goodness, and it's just not true. As a matter of fact, I would argue they do the opposite. And so one of the ways to justify removing all tax exemptions from churches is just to remind people, these people are not promoting morality. Take a look at the human rights legislation, which is one indicator of moral behavior. They tend to oppose many human rights, such as gender equality, gay rights, right to abortion, and various things. So religions are often given a free pass because they're considered to be necessary for morality, necessary for social harmony, and it's just not true.
What about state-sponsored religions? Do you agree that state-sponsored religions are a problem?
Well, yes, that's you're getting towards a theocracy. If you have a state religion, it may not be a full-blown theocracy, but you have a preference for a particular religion. You institutionalize one religion. It breaks religious neutrality, which is one aspect of secularism, and so it's very important that that the state not institute a state religion. And by the way, it's my understanding that the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, it really does not implement full secularism, but it does implement religious neutrality by saying that the state cannot establish a state religion, and that's an important ingredient in secularism. But it doesn't, unfortunately, actually mention separation. Now, the way it's implemented, often it's implemented in such a way to provide some degree of separation. But yes, it's a very bad thing for a state to be able to set up its own, to establish a state religion.
Yeah, sure. All right, Ben Zion, I don't know where John's gone, but Ben Zion, what do you say the roadblocks are to taxing religions?
Well, I'd like to address the concerns of some of our commenters, particularly one that relates to this idea. It was asked a few times by one commenter, how do you expect non-for-profit organizations to be made to pay taxes? And the simple fact is there are many countries that have solved this problem by small changes to the tax code. The United States is not the only country on earth. And there's a lot of countries that do tax churches, and they don't have any great problem in doing so. So it would require not simply one change, but some series of small changes. But I don't see any great impediment to it. I would like to also say that in talking about this relationship of this thing that we value, secularism, and another thing that we value, functioning government. It's important to talk about the problems here in the United States. In the United States, there is effectively a ruling party in the form of the Republicans, and in recent years there has been an undertaking called Project Blitz, which I will also share descriptions of in the comments. And Project Blitz is a coalition of Christian rights groups that is set on undermining the role of secularism in the United States and more or less advancing theocratic ends. And in much the same way that the Koch network and corporatists have undermined and diluted the functioning of our representative government and replaced it with a government run by lobbies and so forth. And this is they're now moving on to the sort of next phase of this in the form of Project Blitz and this ruling party. This is more or less party doctrine. In fact, state houses across the South are populated by legislators who are very much in support of this Project Blitz. So one of the other comments from that very same commenter is the United States really leaning towards theocracy, or in what ways is the United States actually a theocracy? And the answer to that is yes. There are quite a few ways in which the wall between church and state are being undermined, and we need to stand against that more than anything. I think that people are well within their rights to engage with some faith, and religious moderates particularly, and also everybody tends to like to have an identity, and there's nothing wrong with that. But we have to be aware of the ways in which some of these very same ideas can tend to harm the functioning of the civil society.
Ben, if you could just give me a short list of people who would not benefit, who are put under pressure. So obviously secularists, atheists, other religious groups. Who else? LGBT people. Who else is in the short list of people who wouldn't benefit from these sorts of groups undermining the separation of church and state in a free America?
Well, it's always struck me as a little odd that if you look at the Abrahamic faiths, if you look at ultra-Orthodox Jews and many Muslims and fundamentalist Christians, their pet hates, their various chauvinisms that they engage with, mistreatment of women, fear of LGBT people, and so on, tribalist inclinations. They have those three groups that I've just described have more in common with one another than they seem to have in common with their moderate brethren. So the answer to that is yes. It does seem that religious literalists of a more rabid kind do tend to engage in a lot of tribalist silliness, and that has sometimes it's just a lot of sound and fury signifying very little. But in just as many cases, it does start to materialize as attacks on the marginalized groups. In the last few years, we started to hear a president talk about building a wall, and Republicans never even heard of a wall 6 years ago. Nobody talked about a wall, and then suddenly everybody had this idea that a wall was something that needed to be built. And in the aftermath of this kind of lunacy, we now see child concentration camps on our borders. And you have to ask yourselves, if Project Blitz is a success, what other kinds of concentration camps and attacks on marginalized communities are we likely to see? And that's not a question that I hope we will see answered.
John, what do you see? What do you see with these sorts of things? So there's these groups, there's religious groups that are trying to undermine the United States and governments around the world. What do you see? Do you see this as a threat to society if any of these break through and take hold of the reins of government?
I do see it as a threat. I'm in total agreement with Ben. I do want to mention one point, though. Having grown up practicing martial arts, I see a jiu-jitsu opportunity here. And that's that when these laws are put on the books, because they're so absurd, they're fundamentally absurd, and they can't be framed in a way that's airtight, thinking people can find ways to use those laws against them. I'm thinking in particular of one group, and they're not the only ones, but probably the most prominent or the most recent, the Church of the Temple of Satan, where this started out pretty much as a parody religion. And now what they're doing is they're actually getting in there, using these laws to undermine. So, like, for instance, when a local school board allows proselytizing and having evangelicals hand out Bibles in the church, they have after school Satan things, and you can't stop that. If you allow prayer in the school, you can't stop me from praying to Satan. In fact, if you really want to think about it, if I were ever offered an opportunity to pray, what I would do is I would say an old Catholic prayer, which begins, "Hail, Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy, our life, our sweetness, our hope." Because these are the things, because it really shows the hypocrisy of it all. If you're not doing this in the name of fundamentalist religion, fundamentalist Christianity, it's not acceptable. So a Muslim can't get up and say Allah Akbar and have everybody say, yeah, that's great. You don't hear Hindus being able to express their love for Shiva or Vishnu or Brahma, But what you do hear is the in Jesus' name, Jesus saves, all that stuff, and the salvation, all this fundamentalist religion. So yes, it is a threat, but I think when they open up that door, it's a Pandora's box for them. And I think one of the things we should be doing is supporting groups like that who would actually get out there and say, okay, you say that this is the law. Now here I'm gonna take advantage of it. I think Dan Barker did something like this recently. Dan Barker had applied. Did I lose audio, by the way?
Just a little bit. Yeah, you're back now.
Okay, I'm sorry. Dan Barker recently, he and his wife, I believe they've applied for the ministerial exemption for the housing subsidy, because it's one way of saying, okay, if you're going to give it to preachers, you can give it to an atheist advocate, because we're doing the same thing. And so I think that there's a little bit of an opportunity for us to show the absurdity of what they're trying to do and let the public judge. So they want to put 10 commandments on the lawn. The Church of Satan, the Temple of Satan, puts the statue of Baphomet. They don't want Baphomet, so they remove the 10 commandments. You see what I'm saying? So yeah, I do see Project Blitz as a real threat. I also see it as an opportunity for thinking people to turn it around and to show the absurdity of it.
Rand, you must have a lot to say on Project Blitz and other mechanisms and strategies to orientate the state and towards a more religious entity. What do you say?
Well, of course, it's disastrous. I'm not familiar with the details of Project Blitz. I don't live in the States, but clearly they're trying to destroy the religious neutrality, which is part of the U.S. Constitution, which is so essential to freedom and everyone's freedom. And I believe you asked the question, who would suffer the most if they had some degree of success. I think that everyone would suffer, with the exception of just a few leaders of the movement. I think that it would be bad for everyone, not just for minorities, not just for sexual minorities, women are half the population. It'd be disastrous for women, but it would be bad for men too, and both minorities and majorities, because it threatens everyone's quality of life, having to live under the domination of an obscurantist ideology, which imposes attempts to impose the will of God. And of course, in practice, the will of God simply means the will of whoever pretends to speak in the name of God, and that it's a form of totalitarianism. So when it's taken to any great distance, so it would be down the road to totalitarianism. And as a matter of fact, I think that the Abrahamic religions are sort of a model for totalitarian regimes in general. I think that even the Nazis and the Soviets, they were influenced by this monolithic idea of an all-powerful God that they sort of implemented in a secular way. I think that the Abrahamic religions really are the prototype of totalitarianism.
Very interesting. Yeah. So Rand, I want to switch gears just a little bit. I'll ask you to open up on solutions to problems. The world is becoming more complex. We talk all this time about the expansion of the internet, genetic engineering. We've got climate change problems, which is wrecking my country, and it's a big problem that's going to have more impacts. But we've got a lot of different things happening in this emerging world. We've got people going to Mars now. We've got just so many advances are happening right now, and these advances require logic and expertise and rationality and careful consideration and planning and a lot of thought and energy invested into arresting some of the issues in the future. The godly people, not as a whole bunch. I mean, it's too large of a crowd to say, but usually it boils down to saying the Abrahamic faith. It's a very much a single answer. God, it's in God's hands, or God willed it, or don't worry because the Armageddon will come. He'll wipe it all out, and we'll all go to heaven, or in the rapture. Or there's some very simple answers, but for humanists and people who actually want to fix these issues and go on in this reality, some of these answers aren't very compelling. So my question to you is obviously you're talking about ending family hereditary ideas so that children can choose to go their own path and hopefully chart their own lives. And of course, this is just one answer? Is this the core answer to to arresting future problems by enlightening children?
Well, I don't think I have a program to save the world from all future disasters. That's a big agenda to deal with. But when it comes to dealing with the spread of religion, yes, the question of children is at the core of it. That's where religion is transmitted and is perpetrated, and that's how it survives as strong as it does. And so I think it is very important to minimize the degree of indoctrination of children by making sure that school programs do not perpetrate the same things that may happen in families. Let families teach religion, or the religious communities teach their faith to their children if they must, but make sure that is not repeated in the school system. So make sure that the school systems are as secular as possible. One example, this is a very particular example, and I know that in North America, Christianity is a far greater problem. But nevertheless, there are children who are girls who are being veiled at a very young age among Muslims. And that's an example of indoctrination, which I consider to be not only completely unacceptable, but I think it's a form of child abuse to put a veil on a little girl for an extended period of time, like for weeks or months or years. And a lot of people seem to think it's just, I don't know, it's perfectly okay and it's cute, but it's a form of sexual segregation. It's a form of religious segregation. It deprives the child of their ability to play with others, or it gets in the way of their ability to socialize with other children, to play, to exercise. That's just one example. School programs, of course, they should not teach religion except within historical context. And that's important. That's here in Quebec. There's the current government has proposed to abolish a course which it's called Ethics and Religious Culture, which teaches several religions, but teaches them all in a sort of a cartoonish way. They're all sort of caricatures of believers. The Christians all have a big cross, and the Muslim women all wear a veil, and many Muslims don't wear the veil, and the native people all have feathers on the back of their head, and so it's a sort of I think that's very good to get rid of a course which normalizes religion, as it sort of gets across the idea that everybody has a religion, and if you don't have one, you should get one, because it's the cool, and it's everybody needs a religious identity.
One quick question, just for you there. What do you say? Actually, just go around and just answer this with a very few. I'll just ask you all, because I want to actually go back to you, Rand, and ask you another question. But I just want everyone to just fire me back a quick answer. If a religion, say North America, when it was colonized, for example, and certain religions or traditions use drugs, for example, peyote or psychedelics or something. And another religion says that's impure and stamps that out. Is that moral, that they've tamed the uncivilized in a way? Do you know what I mean? Do you guys see it? When one religion subjects another religion to its standards of morality, even though in the eyes of secular people both look a bit, objectively? What do you guys say to that? Rand, I'll just quickly fire a few. Like when they conquer a land and they say you can't use drugs anymore,
Well, it would depend on what drug and how it's used and how dangerous it is. I can't see allowing one religion to tell another to oppose. I mean, we have to come up with non-religious reasons. If this particular drug that they're using is dangerous, then it should be controlled because it's dangerous and not because some other religion doesn't like it. We have to apply policy based on secular principles, non-religious criteria, real-world criteria.
John, what do you say to that?
Well, I think I'm in agreement with David there. I think in the United States, there's a couple of cases where this has had implications. Not quite directly, but like I'm thinking of these ultra-Orthodox rabbis who have syphilis, and yet they're able to perform the circumcision ritual, part of which is biting off the foreskin or what's left of the foreskin after the circumcision takes place, thereby transmitting syphilis to the child. And we know that's a health problem in New York City, and New York City is not stopping that. But what's going on in the United States as a counterbalance to that right now, where a lot of states are looking at it and saying, with faith healing, parents are being held accountable for letting faith be their reason for not having children taken to the doctor when they're seriously sick. So, I see that. I see that we need to bring rationality, as David was saying, into the arena, because otherwise it's not so much one religion here imposing on another, but just imposing on the weakest members of their own religion, which is bad enough.
Ben, what do you see?
Children, especially.
Yeah. Ben, what do you see what do you think about when one religion starts imposing something on another religion because they deem it immoral?
Yeah, well, I think that I suppose we could do an entire show on someone like Margaret Mead and some of the failings of an over imposition of multiculturalist kind of thinking. But I would say that generally, this idea that some culture has managed to civilize some other cultures, it's extremely reductive. All of us have been civilized by more or less a continuous effect of this enlightenment and scientific method being a bigger and bigger part of our lives. And that has relatively little to do with the waxing and waning of cultural properties. It's just something that's began to happen to a higher degree at the invention of the printing press, and then to a far higher degree in the to answer your question, I would say that for one thing, I don't suppose that the use of those substances that you described are particularly uncivilized, but I would tend to say that no, that's not a real effect. It's about as real of an effect as the one that was described earlier in the talk, wherein there is a vacuum in not having religion in your life. That's it's an incredibly reductive view.
Harkening back to the question at the start, this is my final sort of question before we wrap up. Ben, I'll lead on you, and then we'll go back to Rent. What can secular people do? I mean, we've talked a lot about how religious people can get out of secular institutions and secular lives, and sort of hands-off approach from the religious to. What can secular people and secular institutions do? I mean, it's amazing when you expose children to science. Just go to science museums, how much it changes their minds and enlightens their minds to the size and scope of the universe, and all the different wonderful things that are going on in reality. What do you think? Secular people can do to help religious people and in developing countries as well?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that anything that we can do to advance progress and techno progress and economic and political stability is worth doing. And that is why, even though I am sympathetic to religious moderates, I am more sympathetic to discussions of this kind. And I'll throw in something that's maybe slightly off topic as I think an interesting analog here, which is the social credit system of a place. The social credit systems are being pilot tested in a few places, and of course, most controversially used across China. And there's a lot to criticize about that particular model. But one thing that tends to be overlooked in these models generally is that social credit systems of this kind, they encourage the disregarding of these non-useful cultural properties and disruptive and provincial lines of thought. And so I think that things that do that are things that we should be talking about and not only just painting with a broad brush as we tend to do in this country.
John, what do you say? What should secular people do to assist religious people?
Well, I think you hit on my one passion here, because I think the answer in one word, and I won't just give you one word, but it's engage. Because people, if they want to hear something, if they want to learn, if you engage them at the level of credibility, or if something is incredible. For instance, I'm stumbling over my word for a moment, but when people see that there's something wrong, like for instance, a preacher who's making millions of dollars, asking how they feel about that. How do you feel that, some people are struggling to scrape together enough food to put in their children's bellies while these people are living in mansions? Or does it bother you that so-and-so gets a pass because of this? And usually if you can get people to just talk about how they're feeling about it, I think you find a level of commonality, and people can see that we're not the boogeyman, because we're interested in important things. When children are subject to that Islamic rite where they have to take a sword and slash their head and they bleed, and things like that, and we ask about, how do you feel about what's going on for the children there, and what do you think about, somebody brought up the point about the children being veiled, the girls being veiled. I think if we engage with people, if we ask them why they do what they do, why they feel it's appropriate, and we give logical counterpoints, not arguing with them, but just saying, is this a better way of looking at it? Now, that forces us to do the kind of engagement where you're talking beer to beer, as opposed to getting on a platform and speaking and heading up a mass movement. But I really do think that the most effective thing we could do is to engage at the personal level with people where they're at, and to say, is it working for you? Almost like the Dr. Phil, he would say, how's that working for you? I challenge friends, and I call them friends, who are evangelical, who have guns. And again, I don't want to get into the gun debate, but why do you have to have this weapon in your house if God is protecting you? What are you saying about God's protection? And just bringing that rationality into the everyday conversation. I'm convinced we're all, atheists on some level. I react to people, I treat people as atheists, and by engaging them in conversations like this, and more often than not, I find allies. I find very few people who say, I'll pray for you, So that's a little roundabout, but I think engagement is the answer.
Engagement. Thank you very much. Brand, what do you say? What can secular people, institutions, organizations, governments, etc. do? What can they do?
Okay, that's a big question. Well, certainly communication is very important. As John was saying, engaging with people is a form of communication, making sure that everyone is allowed to express their opinion, to discuss these issues and air these issues and stop stifling free expression. If these things are discussed enough, then as John has suggested, there are a lot of religious people who are going to express their own doubts about some of the practices that they have accepted up until then. One thing we can do is, well, the word preach is bad, to preach by example. For example, in recent years, a number of anti-blasphemy laws have been repealed, and this is very important because the existence of blasphemy laws in countries like, say, Ireland, Canada, and others set a very bad example and was used as an excuse by theocracies to apply their own. So that's a very good thing. Promote criticism of religion in general, criticize all religions, at least all the ones that are demographically important. And there are some people who make an exception for Islam, and they almost never criticize it, and that is a very bad thing to leave it out. We need to criticize both Christianity and Islam, as well as Judaism and Hinduism, and name a religion, you can find a place where it's being abused in some way. In India, Hindu nationalism is being used to oppress Muslims, and Islam is being used to oppress Christians greatly in many countries. And anyway, well, those are some ideas.
Fantastic. All right, so thank you everybody for coming. I'll let you all wrap up with some final words. Rand, we'll start with you. What is there anything else you wanted to say? Anything I didn't cover, we didn't talk about, I missed?
Well, I could mention, this is not directly related to the question of hereditary religion, but here in Quebec, we have a law which bans the wearing of religious symbols by some civil servants while they're on duty, including teachers. And our organization supports this law enthusiastically. As a matter of fact, in our opinion, we don't think it goes far enough, but it's an excellent start. And this is very controversial. A lot of people oppose it. And I just want to express the fact that I think it's a very good thing that for secularism, that it's a question of professional ethics. That when a civil servant goes to work, they do not spend a lot of time expressing their political opinions while they're on the job. They can do that off the job, and they should also respect religious neutrality by not wearing obvious religious symbols on the job. That's what I would like to add.
It makes sense because it's public funds, and you don't know where the public funds are coming from. They're coming from people of all faiths, all religions, all ethnicities. So it's,
yes.
Yeah, exactly. All right, John, anything you wanted to say while wrapping up? You just heard that there's a religious law up there in Quebec, or anything I missed, or plug your website or anything. Or Rand, by the way, you want to plug your website or something?
Oh, our website is atheology.ca.
Cool. Thank you very much. John?
Thank you.
Hi. I guess the only other thing I wanted to add was the fact that we should be diligent to stand behind good public policy when we see it, regardless of where it's coming from. Because one of the things that does terrify me, even though I do feel that religion is killing itself in the process, and that we're eventually going to gravitate away from it, as like a lot of the surveys and what we were talking about shows. But I do think that just like the Aztecs reverted to magic when their problems started overwhelming them, instead of looking for technical solutions, people left to themselves may revert to magic if we don't have good policy steering them. So when we see a law that sort of promotes, I'm trying to think of a good example now, but if we see a law that I was mentioning before that sort of discourages letting people subject their children to faith healing. We should adamantly support it. We should be vociferous about it. And even if it's coming from an area that's not directly within our realm of focus, if it's going to help the social order, I think it's in our interest to support that and to be vocal about it.
Very, very good comments. Thank you so much. And I love that point about the Aztecs. I totally agree. I've been talking about this a lot. And as the world starts to break up more and more, the end of Bretton Woods, as climate change starts to go nuts, as a whole bunch of things start to happen around the world, you're going to see a proliferation of scared people. And where do they go? They go back to the thing that's the most comfortable, simple solutions and simple answers already, even though there's just fires here in Australia and hailstorms and the weather's going crazy. Already I've seen people on the street saying the end is near, and that's not very usual for Australia. We don't have much of that, but there are people, who are holding signs saying, these are the signs of the end times, rumors of wars and all this sorts of stuff. So yeah, simple solutions to complicated problems. Yes, Ben's on. Thank you very much for coming back on Detonation. Happy 2020 to you and everybody else on the panel as well. And thank you to the other guests who joined us. Anything you want to say, Ben?
Yes. Well, I really want to thank the panelists for John and David and also David for joining me, and also having the courage to be willing to make some value judgments here. In talking about, John, you mentioned that there are some Christian sects are predominant here in North America, where the panelists all hail from, and there are differences between these sects as to the degree to which they might proselytize or indoctrinate children or engage in unsettling behavior. And we can also say this in looking at, and have said it in this discussion, and looking at the Abrahamic, proselytizing does correlate with a higher degree of religious literalism. This child indoctrination and resistance to criticisms of things of that kind correlates with that kind of fundamentalism. And we have to be willing to talk about these things in the context of the better ordering of a civil society. And I'll call back the point that I made near the top of this talk again, which is that the purpose of these discussions is not to enrage people and move us into some culture war. The purpose of these discussions is to live in a more stable, affluent, and happy world. And I hope that these kinds of discussions do enhance that. I do want to call back one more thing, which I think is important, and that is this role of education, because our friend, a great humanist, Gennady Stoliarov, asked at the top about the role of unschooling and homeschooling, and how we weigh the need to protect these kinds of institutions. Techno-futurists are very interested in ways that decentralized and DIY type institutions might have a role in the 21st century, and how we protect that right, but also ensure that religious fundamentalists are not using that same type of institution to basically abuse their children. And so I think that my feeling is that we need to have a pretty good set of standards, but also encourage this kind of unschooling phenomenon. I think in this, the kind of technological breakthroughs that we see will increasingly allow us to have different approaches to this primary and secondary educational institutions. But finally, I would like to say thank you to everyone who commented, and please do as Mike, our friend, has said, like this video and share it with your friends and subscribe to Detonation. And also please take a moment and go to transhumanist-party.org/membership if you haven't already, and sign up. You don't have to change your faith or your any other political affiliation. You can just follow what we're doing and learn a little bit more about our good work. And finally, please go to benzion2020.com. You can learn a little bit more about our upcoming debate produced by the Free and Equal Election Foundation. That's on March 4th at the Chicago Hilton. A lot of great presidential candidates, including myself, will be there on a televised event. And you can learn about other upcoming exciting events in the coming months. Thank you all for doing this. I really had a nice time.
Yeah, I thank you everybody as well. Thank you everybody, and to the gentleman who left. Thank you everybody. It was fantastic. And look, I need you as a community to hit subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss it. It's more fun when everyone turns up on a live stream. You guys can have a chat and talk about events. Officially, Thrivous is officially sponsoring us as well. So there will be a note in the description of how you can win a bunch of Thrivous products by sharing this video around. I'll leave that. Thrivous, the human enhancement company. Thrivous is our mission to access technology with the greatest potential to improve your brain and body. So I'll leave those stuff in the description, and you guys can go and get some cool Thrivous products from there. You two on the panel as well if you want. So it's all good, and we will be looking for more sponsors, and we'll be getting a Patreon up and running so we can have more shows coming to you about these sorts of topics. And 2020 is going to be a good year for Detonation. It's you, the community, that makes it all happen. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Rand. Thank you, John. We appreciate it. Have a fantastic 2020. It's the start of a new decade, and let's keep coming back and updating on us on your advancements in this field. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right, That's it. Detonation. All more coming to you all this way, all this week, putting death out of business.